So hello everyone, welcome to today's online event, Reclaim Performance Management, New Processes for a Modern Workforce. We're really happy you could find the time to join us today. As you know, the world of performance management has changed considerably over the years, and we are looking forward to making sure the next hour is worth your time. We will be going over which elements of traditional performance management need a modern-day twist in order to be relevant to a modern workplace, and what you can do to reclaim the process you rely on so heavily. So a little about emPerform for those who aren't familiar. We offer simple and all-inclusive performance management software to help organizations automate and streamline performance reviews and other vital talent management processes like 360-degree feedback, succession, pay for performance, and of course, ongoing performance management. If you are still using paper for performance appraisals or would like to put into action some of the key tips that Edie will be handing out today, please contact us or visit our website and you can certainly learn more there. So we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Edie Goldberg as today's host. Dr. Goldberg is principal of E.L. Goldberg and Associates, and she's specialized in talent management for over 25 years now. She's published and presented at numerous conferences on performance management, building management capability, career management, competency modeling, and of course succession planning. She also currently serves as chairperson for HRPS, which is HR People and Strategy. So thank you very much, Dr. Goldberg. We are looking forward to today's presentation. I think with that, I can hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you all for joining me today to discuss innovations in performance management. You have all been hearing a lot of things in the press recently about performance management. And much of this has been about how companies like Juniper, Adobe, Gap Inc., Kelly Services, and even GE are, quote-unquote, getting rid of performance management. But what I'm here to tell you is that's largely an over-exaggeration. While many companies are fundamentally rethinking performance management and transforming it in ways that make it quite different from a traditional process, most of these companies aren't eliminating the basics, setting goals, giving feedback, and paying for performance. What I hope you walk away from this webinar with is an understanding about how to reclaim your performance management process and make it work for your modern workplace. So to quickly review our agenda for today, I'm first going to walk you through a series of assumptions from traditional performance management that we really need to rethink in light of the modern workplace. I'll provide alternative ideas that better fit our contemporary organizations. And this will really be the bulk of the webinar. I'll then help you focus on the key elements that you need to address by sharing what I think are the 5 key areas for you to revamp in your process. And finally, before I close, I'll talk about how you can leverage social technology to create a more dynamic performance management process. Before we get started, I'd like to learn a little bit about where you're coming from in your own performance management journey. So Natalie, will you launch the poll? And what I'd like to hear from you all is your performance management process a key factor in driving performance in your company and motivating your employees to be their best? Let's have everybody respond to that question, and then we'll share the results. Well, you know, your results are not that different from a SHRM survey that recently reported that 75% of HR executives would grade their own performance management process as a C or below. And you know what? Your managers are even more critical of the process. The question is, what's wrong with our current approach, and what can we do about it? Well, now imagine a world where managers and employees are really energized by performance conversations, not depleted by them. Well, we're now going to spend the next approximately 30 minutes examining and reframing some of the more traditional assumptions of performance management for a modern workplace. We'll talk about goal setting, feedback, evaluation, and compensation. And for each traditional assumption, we'll also present an alternative, more modern approach to each aspect of the process. Performance management was born out of the industrial era. And both our workers and our business environment have radically shifted since then. Well, I do believe that the tipping point for change has been sparked by the rise of the millennial generation. These changes have really been coming for a long time as our business environment has shifted, making traditional practices no longer appropriate for a modern workplace. So let's examine these more closely now. Most traditional performance management processes were designed based on the assumption that annual goal setting is an effective way to manage the business. And this may have once been appropriate for slow-moving companies with lumbering parts and deliverables. But this process is out of pace with today's organizations that need to constantly adjust priorities to meet changing business needs. In today's fast-paced world, constantly changing business environment, agility is the key to success. When business priorities change, employees must be able to quickly reprioritize and keep their focus on the things that matter the most. In fact, recent research has demonstrated that companies that review and revise goals more often had higher performance than organizations that reviewed goals annually or even semi-annually. Even big companies like GE are moving towards processes where they're setting near-term goals, not annual goals. Susan Peters, GE's head of human resources, was recently quoted as saying, "The world really isn't on an annual cycle anymore for anything. So it's time to create a process that's more agile." Today's performance management processes assume that individuals should set goals for themselves individually, although they are usually tied to a team or a department goal. Regardless, individuals are held accountable to their own goals, and usually only the employee and their manager has insight into progress against those individual goals, or even what those individual goals are. While team-based work has been around for centuries, the complexity of work has driven an increase in the amount of collaboration in the contemporary workplace. Organizations are becoming flatter, leaner, and more agile. And at the same time, jobs are becoming more complex and more global in scope. All of these factors make it more difficult for any one person to do a job in isolation from their teammates. Nearly all organizations employ teams in some manner, whether they're project teams, standing committees, task forces, self-directed work teams, or emergency response teams. The importance of regular communication within and across teams is magnified by the fact that these teams are often operating both virtually and globally. Some team members may never have met each other in person, which makes it all the more essential that they're confident that they're on track with their individual deliverables that serve team goals. So today, more than ever before, it's probably more appropriate for individuals to either set team-based goals or to share their goals and progress against their goals with their teammates. This way, the entire team can keep track of how they're collectively performing, and they can lend a hand when needed for the greater good of the team. Traditionally, we've assumed that the manager should be the sole evaluator of an employee's performance. But does this still make sense in light of today's organization dynamics? Let's consider a few factors. First, many employees experience frequent management turnover through restructuring or other changes. Therefore, the reliance on what I refer to as the manager of the moment may not provide the most complete view on an employee's performance. Second, many employees have dual reporting relationships, necessitating input from more than one manager. Most organizations handle such scenarios in an ad hoc fashion. However, technology solutions now can accommodate feedback from multiple individuals, as opposed to being limited to just one manager. Third, today's managers may not be co-located with employees, and thus they may not always be the best source of input, particularly in technology jobs where peers may be a better judge of skill than their managers. And fourth, by 2020, more than half of the employees in the workforce will be millennials. Therefore, understanding the mindset of the millennial employee is critical to rethinking performance management. This generation values feedback from those they respect, as opposed to those in a hierarchical model that assumes only the immediate manager's opinions count. This suggests that it's time for organizations to reconsider what are the most valued sources of feedback for employees and what practices best fit the company's culture. So whether the company utilizes more of a 360 approach to feedback and evaluation, or if they move to a completely crowdsourced performance management feedback process, getting input from people beyond the manager is clearly a direction that we should be moving toward. The traditional annual performance management process assumes that an annual or semi-annual pat on the back or performance correction is sufficient to motivate and retain employees. You know, I often wonder how we ended up with this assumption. The research and goal setting clearly illustrates that for goals to be motivating, individuals need to not only personally commit to the goals that they're striving for, but they must be provided with regular, ongoing feedback on progress towards the goal. So the traditional process we have today is simply insufficient to create a motivating environment. Also, let's consider again our growing base of millennial workers. This is a generation that's used to getting information when they want it. Their life has always included the internet, and they expect immediate access to information as a matter of course. And let's face it, employees of any age are constantly making stay or leave decisions because they do have other opportunities. How frequently they're recognized for their work or getting information about how to have greater impact will drive their motivation and desire to stay with an organization. We need to move beyond occasional feedback to ongoing coaching for performance. Companies like Adobe, GE, Synaptics, and Gap Inc. have changed their processes to either eliminate or in most cases de-emphasize the end-of-year review by moving towards regular check-ins where managers and employees can meet to discuss progress against goals and ongoing performance in the workplace so that course corrections can be made along the way and recognition can be given for excellent work to keep motivation strong and reinforce positive behaviors. Some of these companies are also employing technologies that provide an easy way for anyone to provide feedback in the moment when they observe behaviors they want to recognize or modify to help that employee have a greater impact. A majority of performance management processes hold the assumption that the manager should provide judgment on an employee's performance. This conversation is primarily one way, with a manager conveying his or her evaluation of the employee and the employee sitting there listening to the judgment that's being placed on their performance. In this traditional approach, managers are focused on evaluating what's happened in the past and can't be changed. Today, we're seeing many companies shift away from this rear-view mirror approach of evaluating past performance and replacing it with a more forward-looking approach of coaching for performance. This places less emphasis on evaluation and more on providing employees with the skills and information they need to be successful. So in this new coaching for performance approach, we see a change in the dynamics of the conversation to creating more of a two-way dialogue for discussing performance and a change from focusing on the past to helping employees be successful in the future. In a recent benchmarking study that I completed, all of the companies that I interviewed were currently looking at how to improve the coaching and development aspects of their process. They all felt that this was the one part of the process that would become increasingly important for attracting and retaining talent moving forward. Having managers be more supportive and providing coaching that will facilitate ongoing performance improvement is becoming the new cornerstone for performance management. Now, before I go on into the next section, I have another poll, and I'd like to get a feeling for what rating scale you're currently using in your performance reviews. So Natalie, will you go ahead and launch that poll?
So we have about 90% of people who have voted. I think we can share the answers now, Edie.
Okay, go ahead and share the answers.
Great. So we have 11% who said they are not using rating scales.
Wow.
8% a 4, 7, or 10-point scale. 16% said other, and 65% said 3 or 5-point scale.
Okay, so that 3 or 5-point scale tends to be, kind of the most common scale. I'm very impressed with several that are using nothing, and I'm very curious as to those that are using another. But let's go on. Since performance appraisals were created, our general assumption has been that performance across the entire organization should be normally distributed. That is, there should be a small number of high performers, a small number of poor performers, and most of the people will be in the middle or average performance with, a few variations on the ends. And most of your rating scales reflect this assumption. So whether or not your company forces the distribution to be normal, which is a completely different conversation, we would generally assume that over a large number of people, this is the distribution we would get. However, recent research from O'Boyle and McGinnis has completely thrown a wrench into this assumption. They have found that across a wide variety of samples in different industries and different professions, that performance is not normally distributed, but rather performance is best represented by what's called a power law distribution curve. Here you can see that a small number of elite individuals are accountable for majority of performance in the company, and there's a significant drop-off in productivity, and a majority of employees are average performers with very few poor performers. Presumably, few poor performers because we've screened them out from a selection process, or we've terminated them before they got to the review process. So really looking, at the axis on the left-hand side, that's performance. So you see a high amount of performance, but just by a few number of employees, and then it drops off. This finding has significant repercussions for how we manage the talent in our organization, and the need to shift our assumption of performance to focus on identifying and retaining those elite or those hyper performers that we have on here. Well, traditional performance management processes are often so focused on the accuracy of ratings that many companies believe that they're reducing manager bias by creating a really complex formula from which the final answer about performance will be derived. So we weight goals, and we determine that results are worth 60%, behaviors are worth 40% of the overall score, and then magically we're going to have this really accurate picture of an individual's performance. And there have been many reasons why we've been fooled by the appearance of accuracy from this very complex process that we set out. But most of it is really just about human nature. Now first, many of you have recently heard about Accenture changing their approach to performance management. This has kind of been all over the press recently. And one of their key design elements emanates from the psychological research that demonstrates that more can be learned about the rater and their personal biases than about the ratee from the performance ratings. And while I certainly do not dispute this comment in the least, we also know that providing training to raters on evaluation errors goes a long way in overcoming some of those biases, but nonetheless, some of this still persists. Second, if we were to use performance ratings strictly for development, then the research would tell us that we would come up with very different ratings than we do when we use performance evaluations to make personnel decisions, such as compensation raises or bonus distributions. Now, this is interesting. Time and again, when I run focus groups asking managers what they really do to determine the final ratings, do they follow the strict formula that we give them, or are they doing something else? I hear more stories about the fact that they start with what they want the employee to get from a bonus or merit increase standpoint, and then they back into the ratings that they need to get the compensation they want. So here we confound the performance rating with how we distribute compensation, and when we hardwire them together, we find that managers simply manipulate the system to get the outcome that they want for their employees. So this really complex formula that we've created to come up with this supremely accurate rating is subjected to human manipulation to reach an altogether different outcome. So much for accuracy. Well, we're beginning really to see a trend towards simplification of the rating process. And it turns out that all the precision that we've built into the system is just being manipulated down the line. So it's really a lot of work for no actual outcome. While weighting of goals does provide the benefit of communicating to employees which goal is more important to their overall performance, this can also be done in a conversation. Simplification may take the form of eliminating the weighting of goals, reducing the number of goals, reducing the number of ratings, or eliminating ratings altogether. Every company takes their own path, but making the process more authentic and straightforward is certainly a trend that I think is here to stay. One path for simplification is tied to the prior concept regarding performance distributions. Rather than focusing so much energy on creating differentiation between people in the middle of the rating scale, the 2, 3, 4, some companies are simplifying their rating scale altogether, or their communications, so that you kind of end up with the top 10% people who are at risk of losing their job, and everybody else who's really kind of performing well as expected. These companies that are moving to this form of simplification are really focused on recognizing and rewarding exceptional performance, and then communicating to the majority of employees that their work is deeply appreciated and they'll continue to be paid fairly relative to the market, with adjustments reflecting more of an increase in proficiency or scope in their role, or a simple cost of living increase. The next assumption we make about performance management is that employees need to be rated to understand where they stand. We also believe that we need that rating to support all elements of talent management. Well, as many of you on this call know, there has been a recent trend of companies eliminating ratings from their performance management process. And this is to put more focus on the dialogue and to minimize unintended consequences of rating a majority of employees as meets expectations, a label that does not give most of your employees the warm fuzzies. The field of neuroscience has been contributing to our understanding about how to successfully lead and manage employees over the past 5 years. And what we know is this. Every 5 seconds, the brain searches for a threat or reward state. And unfortunately, our performance management process is filled with elements that create a threat response, the impact of which is that our brain literally turns off its creativity center and shuts down to new information in a protection state. This really isn't very good for having performance conversations because often the employee stops listening to what the manager has to say because they feel threatened by the conversation. David Rock has put forth a model that explains an individual's response to the traditional annual performance review process. Let me quickly review the 5 elements of his SCARF model. We start with status. During a performance review discussion, our status might be threatened by the rating we receive and how it compares to prior evaluations. And since we know that a majority of people believe that they are above average, we know that a majority of people will perceive their rating as a threat to their status. Change creates uncertainty. A change in how I've been rated will create a stress reaction. And certainly, bottling up feedback for the end-of-year conversation creates uncertainty in the outcome of that discussion. The brain likes control and stability, and it likes to be in the driver's seat. But in the performance review conversation, the manager is in the driver's seat, and that decreases an employee's level of autonomy and is perceived as a threat. Our brain pretty quickly computes how much alike we are to those people around us. If we dislike our manager, our brain would automatically dismiss any evaluation he or she provided. But if our rating is less than stellar, it might be a threat to a relationship we have with a manager we like. And finally, if we perceive bias or favoritism in our rating, or if we don't feel that our rewards are appropriate for the effort we gave or appropriate relative to our peers, then we'll perceive a conversation about pay or performance as a threat. Because companies don't want to put people in a threat state, and they want to create a process that helps turn people's brains on, not off, many companies have chosen to eliminate ratings in their process. This doesn't mean that they're not discussing performance. They are. They're just not labeling the performance of an individual, and the conversation is more of a dialogue about helping the employee be successful. Recently, Eli Lilly shared some interesting results that they had in their journey in performance management, where they did indeed eliminate ratings. But they were looking at their employee engagement scores and looking at the end-of-the-year performance review time and how that impacted employee engagement scores. Well, they didn't really set out to do that. They were actually using a pulse survey process to assess employee engagement every month from a sample of employees. And when they looked back over their data over several years, what they noticed was a really interesting trend. Right after the performance rating process, there was a significant drop in engagement for 85% of the population. And this drop in engagement stayed down for like 3 or 4 months. The people, as they kind of dug into this deeper, they found out that it was the people on a 5-point scale that were rated 4 or lower, where the employees had a big drop in engagement. And it was a big drop in engagement, and it was sustained for a number of months. But what was really interesting is even those people who were rated a 5 had a small drop in engagement scores. And it didn't last as long, but going through this performance review process, this rating process, did impact their employee engagement scores. So kind of interesting results. The traditional performance management process provides managers with very specific guidelines that they're supposed to follow in determining compensation. And if an employee gets rated a 3, then their merit increase should be within a specific range, and it's dependent on a few other variables like proficiency and compa ratios. But anything outside of these guidelines gets flagged as an exception and receives a lot of scrutiny from higher level managers. So as we know, most managers want to avoid that kind of scrutiny. These guidelines are really provided to ensure fairness across the company. But today, we're seeing a trend to move toward providing managers with broad guidance and then allowing them to make compensation decisions within their budget. This relies more on management judgment than reliance on a formula, which we kind of discussed earlier. The guidance provided is often based on the values that a company holds regarding pay and performance. For example, I have a client who doesn't provide any ratings at the end of the year, but strongly believes in pay for performance. Managers are given a budget and then provided with a company philosophy that encourages them to differentiate and reward for great results and great leadership. Contrary to the traditional approach, which emphasizes guidelines to promote fairness, Laszlo Bock, who's the SVP of People Operations at Google, encourages managers to, quote-unquote, pay unfairly. He argues that fairness in pay doesn't mean that everyone in the same job is paid the same or within 20% of one another. He believes that what's really fair is to pay people commensurate with their contribution. Based on that power law distribution curve I showed you earlier, some people should be paid significantly more than their peers because they contribute significantly more. So the guidance at Google is to pay people based on the value that they add to their business. So all of the issues that I've raised thus far, I want you to take away 5 specific things that you should consider examining in your process today. First, does your goal-setting process appropriately reflect the rhythm of your organization? Are you reviewing and resetting goals as necessary to keep up with the changing dynamics of your business? Are individuals setting goals independently, or do they either set goals with their team or share progress with their team members? How well does your goal-setting process reflect how you operate as a business? Second, annual or semi-annual feedback will not motivate or retain top talent. In fact, managers are pretty terrible at tracking performance throughout the year. So saving up feedback for an annual discussion not only makes the feedback meaningless and unhelpful, but a lot of information will get lost in the process. You need to find a way to provide more regular, ongoing feedback to employees. Some companies have done this by having weekly, monthly, or quarterly check-ins. Others have leveraged technology to invite a constant stream of feedback. Next, the nature of the conversation with managers needs to change from, let me tell you what I think of you, to creating more of a two-way dialogue that emphasizes coaching to help an individual perform better in the future. We can't change what's happened in the past. The best use of a manager's time is not rehashing what went wrong, but how future situations can be more effectively approached for a more successful outcome. So investing money in teaching managers how to coach will be well worth your effort. Fourth, while I can't imagine a time where the manager won't be part of the feedback process, consider opening up your process to provide the employee with feedback from those they work with on a regular basis. They may value that feedback even more. And it may also be possible to include those sources as part of the evaluation process. We are seeing a rise in the number of companies using 360 reviews in part of the evaluation process. And while it's not always a good idea, this can provide a more well-rounded point of view of the individual. And finally, labeling employees. Given the fact that performance may not be normally distributed in your company, and the fact that labeling the majority of your employees as meets expectations may be demeaning to those employees who work really hard for the high expectations that you set, you should consider eliminating the use of labels or strongly simplifying the evaluation process to put more emphasis on identifying extraordinary performance. Now I'd like to move on to two broader topics: the overall concept of performance management and the importance of leveraging technology for your process. Performance management was born in the industrial era. Today's knowledge workers are motivated in a completely different way than employees were back then. Today's knowledge workers are motivated by an internal sense of fulfillment, by doing interesting work and developing their expertise. According to Dan Pink, knowledge workers want autonomy, mastery, and purpose. In other words, they really don't want their performance managed by anybody. So you might consider that using the term performance management sends a subtle message to your employees that they need to be managed. What if we moved away from this terminology and focused our process less on managing people and more on inspiring great performance? How would that change the way you approach your process? We need a process that's more suitable for today's knowledge workers, and we need to move from managing to inspiring employees. So consider changing the name of your process as a symbol of the change in the dynamic that you're trying to create. So what can technology do to help? Well, when most people think about technology and performance management, they simply think about automating the process that they already have, simply converting your old traditional paper and pencil form into an automated system. Sure, with this new automated system, you can track where people are in the process and how many people have completed their reviews. You can also look at the average scores for employees across your competencies and leverage that data in really useful ways. But with today's technology capabilities, we can go far beyond simply automating a process to helping create a process that's more dynamic by including more capabilities that are more social in nature. A study from the McKinsey Global Institute reports that 2/3 of the value creation offered by social technologies lie in improving communication and collaboration within and across the enterprise. McKinsey estimates that by using social technologies, companies could see a rise in productivity by knowledge workers of 20 to 25%. That's pretty impressive. Some companies today are beginning to leverage social technologies to create a more dynamic performance management process. And there are a variety of different ways that we can make the process more dynamic. Let's start with the goal-setting process. Remember that earlier we talked about the fact that today's employees are often working in teams. Some performance management technology platforms allow you to share goals across a team or a department so that employees can see how their teammates are tracking against goals, so they'll know how the entire team is tracking against their collective performance. With this information, a team member can anticipate when the entire team is falling behind or when a dependent goal is at risk. This way they can jump in and help a peer for the greater good of the team. Or perhaps you set a goal as a team and the manager can share with everyone how the team is collectively performing against their goals. This type of ongoing feedback against goal performance is precisely the type of feedback that employees need to make goals motivating. A second way that we can leverage technology is to make the performance management process, a second way we can leverage technology to make the performance management process more dynamic is by using many of the new social features that are now available. Employees can electronically ask for feedback immediately following an important event. Alternatively, peers can provide recognition or just-in-time feedback to people they work with remotely, or even if they're in the same office and are just more comfortable providing feedback via a social application, just like they do with Facebook or Twitter. In fact, some vendors are creating platforms that are designed for mobile devices so that recognition or feedback can be documented in the moment rather than waiting to get back to one's computer or waiting to see a person face-to-face. So these new technology tools provide an easier way to gather performance input from people beyond the employee's direct manager. Recently, a client of mine in the technology industry wanted to make sure that their employees were getting more real-time performance feedback. In addition to integrating their current technology-based recognition program into the performance management process, they also leveraged a new technology solution to allow the employee to both invite feedback from others at any time, as well as allow employees to send feedback to their peers at any time. This system also provides a place for managers to take notes throughout the year so that they can comment on them in the next regular one-on-one. Most importantly, all of these points of feedback are available at the end of the year summary review, which simply pulls together all of the feedback an individual has received across the 4 quarters. So there are no surprises in the discussion, and it's simply a documentation of what's already occurred. So before I open up the webinar for questions, what I hope you take away from the webinar is 2 main points. First, business dynamics have changed significantly over the past decade or 2. And those changes are driving increases in companies looking to fundamentally change their approach to managing performance. Start with an understanding of your own business dynamics. Do you operate in a matrix structure? Do your employees work in teams? Is your workforce globally distributed? Does the pace of change in your company influence the frequency with which you set or reassess goals? Examine your current process through the lens of how you operate as a business, and then figure out what you need to change to support your current business operations and your company culture. Second, can you leverage technology not simply to automate your process, but to help you create a more dynamic process that provides ongoing feedback and recognition to employees to supplement the coaching that they're getting from their managers and to keep employees engaged and informed about how the team is progressing against their shared goals? So thank you for listening. And what I want to do is open it up to questions.
Wow, thank you, Edie. Just so much incredible insight into this important topic. I'm certain everything you discussed hit home with most, if not all, of today's attendees. Really the importance of identifying talent when you consider the distribution being closer to the power law model, bias in reviews, feedback being relatively useless if it's saved up, peers being more equipped to judge competency than managers in some instances, and my favorite is the neuroscience of ratings and the drops in engagement. So just great, thank you very much. What I'd like to do now, like Edie said, is open the floor to questions. We've received quite a few during the presentation, and we will certainly do our best to get to them all. So if you do have a question, please type it into your GoToWebinar panel. So Edie, I have a few already here. I'll start asking. The first, if you eliminate ratings, how do you tie pay to performance?
That's a really great question, and I just finished helping a client move from ratings to no ratings, and I have to tell you, we talked about this as the bridge to compensation, and we must have spent, probably 80% of our meeting time just really focused on this. The conversation about performance is still, a very important piece to consider. And I would guarantee you that and I've done this, in many companies and many focus groups, that if you go and you ask your managers, who are your best performers? Who's really making a substantial difference? Who are those extraordinary performers? They don't need a rating process to tell you that. They know that. And so what we do is we help managers think through what are the elements of performance so they can think through those and have a dialogue about performance without assigning a label or a number to the individual. But then when it comes to compensation, you come back to what is your philosophy around pay for performance. And if you have a philosophy that says we want to really differentiate and we want to reward exceptional performance, then you give your managers their budget and you say, okay, this can't be peanut buttered, and we want you to, within the budget that you have, make sure that those individuals who are, having the greatest amount of productivity for your group or making the biggest difference, that you truly differentiate their rewards. So it still happens from a rewards perspective, but it's not formulaic. So it does require more manager judgment. And I will tell you, at first, your managers will be a little afraid. And so you do need to provide them with some guidance about how to do this, some philosophies, some frameworks for helping them think through how to do that. But in the end, the results that I've seen from the companies that have done this, they've actually achieved greater pay differentiation, not less pay differentiation, because managers really kind of had the handcuffs off in terms of, the current guidelines that they have are, we have such small budgets, there's not a lot of differentiation in pay given those small bonus budgets or merit budgets. But if you just kind of take it all off and you say, truly reward exceptional performance, and everybody else make sure that they're, paid appropriately to the market, we're finding that managers can do that without the structure of a number that is driving the compensation decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've received a number of questions on that very topic, so thank you for clarifying. And it ties right into what you were saying about, guidance versus guidelines. Okay, great. Thanks, Edie. The next question I have, my managers already complain about once-a-year reviews. How have other companies had success with monthly or quarterly performance updates or meetings? So there's a good one for you.
That's great. So, managers are complaining about the annual process is you're saving it all up. So there's a lot to discuss, and there's a lot to go over, and we're talking about the entire year's performance and things that have happened all throughout the year. So it takes a lot of time to think about it. It takes a lot of time to prepare for it. Often they're documenting a lot about that. So it is a lot of work. The companies that have moved to kind of whether it be quarterly check-ins or even monthly check-ins, the documentation is either non-existent or extremely minimal. And I would say if they're having monthly check-ins, those have no documentation. Quarterly, some may be documented, some may not be documented. One of my clients, they document on the mid-year and the end-of-year dialogues, but on the off quarters, they don't document. It's just a conversation. And because the trick is making it not an HR administrative process, but the way work gets done. So if we're tying it to performance and the achievement of goals, it's really about making it making the conversation more about just how you're doing the work and not this separate administrative process. And so the more it is the rhythm of the way we get things done here, and the less focus on the documentation, particularly in the more frequent conversations, then you can make it more accessible and easier for managers to do. And you're actually helping them to achieve more with their groups. So it is certainly self-serving for the managers to learn how to manage better and how to be on top of performance, but it is just informal check-ins. They're not these big formalized processes. And that's the difference, and that's what really kind of makes it work.
Definitely. Great answer, Edie. Thank you. Next question I have is 360 feedback best used for development and not personnel decisions?
Well, yes. I mean, and I'm an industrial psychologist by training, so I will tell you that, the research has always said that, 360 feedback is, in most situations, best used for development purposes only. But it's very interesting. We are seeing, because of the millennial mindset and the interest in feedback from peers and perhaps even other managers, we are seeing a huge rise in 360 feedback for performance decisions. And I'm going to use the term 360, and I'm going to clarify that there is a difference here. There is a difference between having a formalized competency 360 assessment approach where there's like a formal report. That's one form of 360, and tying that to ratings. That's different. A lot of people, when they're referring to 360 and performance review, they're really just talking about getting input from other people. And so we're seeing that more and more often, not actually formally ratings from other people, but that does happen as well. The organization would have to be prepared for that. So typically, if you were using a formalized rating process for 360, it would be introduced for development purposes first. Once the organization is very comfortable with that and everybody thinks it's fair and honest, you might move towards using it for decision-making purposes. The caveat is, and I have this with one of my clients right now, they do use 360 for performance decisions. And recently I was doing some focus groups with employees and found out that people are a little reticent to provide lower ratings because they know it will affect people's comp. So you do end up getting this very, minimized distribution of your ratings. And you have to look for those things and determine, is this process working for us now if you do move it towards using for decision-making purposes. So my answer is, in general, 360, a true 360 where you're rating people on behaviors is best used for development. There are situations where it can be used in performance management, but with caution.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you again, Edie. If you have any questions for emPerform or Edie, please contact us. The details are right there. A reminder that we will be sending out the recording and slides early next week. I had a few people ask about that. You will also see a survey pop up after the event closes. Please take a moment to provide your feedback. We are always looking to make these events as relevant as possible. If you are looking for other great talent management webinars, visit the emPerform on-demand webinar library on the employee-performance website. And of course, if you are looking for ways to implement Edie's suggestions into your organizations, contact us and we'd be happy to help. So thank you again, Edie, and thank you to everyone who joined. Have a lovely afternoon.